Good evening, Catherine and Maria. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, good evening.
We'll be starting here shortly. I think we're gonna have a small crowd tonight. It's gonna be hard to compete with this nice weather.
I mean, we only get so much of it, right? So if you got stuff to do today, you got to get out there and do it.
Right. I'm trying to get my garden bed ready to go. I just need to build my raised beds with the tiller.
I was not good and I didn't do a very good fall and winter cleanup. So I got to go remove dead plants and get everything kind of tidied up so they can come in and mow a few times before everything gets tilled.
Nice. Yep. The violets started popping up in our garden pretty heavy last week. So it was pretty quick work of the rototiller to get rid of those. And if I was thinking, I would have taken some pictures, but I was busy rototilling. I added a lot of compost in the last year, and it is noticeably different in the amount of organic matter just in soil color and texture.
I believe it. I've done a lot to the raised beds back here, and the texture and everything's just way better. But I don't know what they used to fill them previously. They were okay.
Yeah. Give it just another minute here. All right, Cassandra, should we get going?
Yeah, go ahead and start. I'm going to send out one more email just to make sure I caught everybody since there were a few late additions and I don't want to miss everybody. So forgive me if you already have the email from me. You're going to get one more from me. But yeah, we can go ahead and get started.
Okay. All right. Well, for those of you who've been joining us for the last, I guess tonight is week 5. You know who I am, but I'm Lee Beers. I'm the extension educator for Ag and Natural Resources here in Trumbull County with OSU Extension. If you do have any questions, we are right here in Cortland. We are not based out of Columbus. We're right here by the lake. So if you do have any questions, you can stop in and see us. Get any of your questions answered or by email or phone, feel free to reach out. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we can improve our healthy soils to have a productive and rewarding garden. A lot of times we put a lot of work into our gardens and they don't always return the favor with a lot of produce or otherwise. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put those in the chat box. I have no problems if you want to interrupt me. We have a small group. I want to make sure that if you have questions about soil fertility or growing any crops that you have questions about, I want to make sure you leave here tonight with some answers and maybe some tools in your toolbox to help you be a little bit more successful. Okay. So when we're talking about soil health, the first thing we need to do is, where do we start? And we always start with the soil test. How many of you have said, I'm going to put down this much fertilizer because this is what my dad did, or my grandparents, or my sister's mother-in-law grows the best tomatoes in the world. It's okay if you do that, but a lot of times when we get those soil tests that come in after soil testing for the first time in 10, 15, 20 years, we are overloading the soil with nutrients to the point where we can dig out a 10 by 10 garden and fertilize 30 or 40 acres of corn because the phosphorus levels and potassium levels are that high. And the only way to know for certain how much nutrients you need and what nutrients you need is to do a soil test. So if you're not sure where to do a soil test, you can purchase one at any extension office. So if you're in Trumbull County, we have an online option. You can order it. We'll mail it to you. When you get your results, we get a copy in the office. We can walk you through what it's telling you. And later on in the presentation, we're going to go over a little bit about what's on those soil test reports and recommendations. And sometimes the best soil amendment is nothing. Again, we're going to show you examples where it's your soil is essentially fertilizer. So adding anything more to that, you're not actually going to see the benefits of any increase in yield or anything like that. And again, if you need soil tests, you can stop into our office or mail them out. And you do not have to get a soil test from OSU Extension for us to help you. If you get a soil test from Centera or any other organization, if you get the test and say, I don't know what this is saying, Lee, I would be happy to help you out. So we need to ask ourselves, is my soil healthy? So there are three big things that we can look at to determine about how healthy our soil is. The physical properties: aggregate stability, compaction, water infiltration. Chemical properties: what are the soil nutrients in there, the pH, heavy metals, contaminants, biologicals, microbes, earthworms, and organic matter. The chemical properties and the biological properties, those are things we can influence. Some of the physical properties, a lot of those are based on what we have left over from the glaciers. So here in Trumbull County, everybody thinks we have clay soils. Most of the county has silt loam. There's a couple of pockets of sandy soil, but there's really nothing you can do to change the soil that you have. So if you have clay soils or silt loam, short of digging that out and putting in 10, 12 inches of a different soil type, whatever the glaciers left you is what you're stuck with. The only way to change that is really for another ice age to come in, drop a lot of gravel, and hope it drags away all the clay and not leave you more. Okay. Compaction is one thing we can definitely influence, whether you're driving a tractor over the same path over and over and over again. So if you are using a tractor to harvest your tomatoes and you keep following the same path over and over time, that will lead to compaction in those areas. If you're using a rototiller or plow or some sort of tillage equipment, when you do that, you are creating a very loose soil top that's 4 to 6 inches deep, but right below that, you stick a shovel down in, it's going to go down 4 to 6 inches, and then you're going to hit what's called the plow pan, and you've essentially compacted that plow area. Chemical properties: fertility, we can add fertilizer, compost, organic matter, manure. The list goes on and on to adjust our pH or our fertility. pH, if you add lime, wood ash, sulfur, all of those things we add will adjust our pH a little bit. Heavy metals, so if you are in an urban environment especially, this is more of a concern. If you are on an empty lot where there was a house that maybe had lead paint, you want to make sure that you are not using contaminated soil there. Biological properties, these are something that you can go out and get microbes and earthworms and put down there, but that's better to just let them come naturally. By having a healthy soil, those microbes are going to want to show up on their own and be here anyways. So soil is not dirt. So it's a single most important ingredient of gardening. So if you have a depleted soil, you're not going to have a very rewarding or a good experience of gardening. So you should understand the basic soil properties and characteristics. Here we can see this. It's a nice dark color. Can everybody see my pointer? I hope so. So there's a nice dark color, and you can see some sticks, some organic matter in there. This looks like it's a good soil. And if we make a tight fist out of that soil, it's not going to hold its shape very well. It's likely to crumble back apart, meaning it's going to have some good soil or water infiltration. So managing your soil is very important. So every time you are tilling, you are breaking down organic matter, you're breaking down soil structure. You want to be very aware of what you're doing to your garden soil, even though sometimes it's super easy to plant in a nicely worked garden. It's not always what's best. You may actually be losing some of your hard work by trying to build organic matter. Every time you till, you'll be losing some of that. So what is your soil made of? So again, going back to the glaciers, what the glaciers dropped is kind of what we're stuck with. So the mineral matter, that's from our underlying bedrock material. Sometimes you have to go down pretty deep to find that bedrock material. You know, if you're over in Howland, Brookfield area, maybe not so far, but where I am in Champion, you're going to go a long ways before you find bedrock. And before you find that bedrock, you're going to find blue clay and a lot of very, very acidic soil. So that's part of what our soil is. The organic material. So every time we are introducing some plant material, either dead or living, that adds to the organic material that can be broken down, and those nutrients are released from that breakdown process. Microbes, we have bacteria, fungi, and algae. Some good, some bad, right? So we do need the fungi to break down that dead material because that process of breaking down those leaves releases those nutrients into the soil. In macroinvertebrates, we have earthworms, springtail, mites, centipedes, beetles. Again, good and bad. Some are pests, some are not. And pore space, so open area for air. So what do we need soil for? Obviously, plants need soil, but they need capacity to provide and hold and cycle nutrients. So again, the surface of that soil particle will have spots available for nutrients to attach to it. Water infiltration, storage, and drainage. Oh, here, let me get Bob in here. Support, promote food and fiber production. Carbon sequestration. So you're going to see a lot of this in the news because carbon credits and carbon credit trading is becoming very popular in Ohio. And pest and weed suppression. So if we have a healthy soil and we are rotating our crops appropriately, we are going to reduce the amount of pest pressure over time. And bioremediation, you may have heard of that. So you can actually use some soils and plants to take those harmful chemicals out of the soil. So here we have some soil horizons and soil depth, A, B, C, and then our bedrock. So these are just different layers. As we dig down in a trench, you can see the different layers. So if we look at this middle one, we have topsoil. Typically that's 4 to 6, maybe 8 inches, depending on where you're at. And then you get into the subsoil and then bedrock or further horizons down that are different soil types. But most of our root growth is going to be in that topsoil and subsoil area. So when we are doing a soil test, we want to determine what are our nutrients in this top 8 inches of soil, okay? Because 80 to 90% of our roots will be in that top 8 inches, and the rest will go down a little bit further. But those roots aren't necessarily looking for nutrients, they're looking for water. So soil color can be a good indicator. It can tell you about organic matter, content, productivity, and drainage. So if we take a slice of our dirt with a shovel, here you can see this square in the yellow. that looks a little bit less compacted, right? So that's going to be our topsoil. If you had to guess, where is that soil going to drain to? It's going to drain down through this because it's not as tightly compacted. But once it hits this harder clay area, that is going to really prevent a lot of our drainage. So what we get, I like to call, is the bathtub effect. So we have water that's sitting there, and then it doesn't go down through that subsoil as fast as we would like. So we have a lot of surface water that kind of sits at the top. And you can see the dark color. Typically, the darker the color is going to tell you a little bit more about your organic matter. If you have a light gray, light brown soil, you're going to be pretty light in your organic matter. Your organic soils that are going to be very high organic matter are going to be dark brown, almost look black. Okay, so I will ask you to jump in with the chat box or unmute yourself. If we want to grade these soils, we're going to look at this one over here on a scale of A to F. A is a good soil, F is the worst. How would you rate this soil on the left? Go ahead, unmute, use the chat box, whatever you prefer. I'll give it a second. There's no right or wrong answer. A D, okay. F. All right. Anybody else want to share? D minus, a C, okay. All right. So if you're looking at these, an E, okay. If we look at this, and I'm guessing you're looking at this as well, and you're saying this looks okay, but what do you notice about the color? It's kind of a pale color. It's not a dark, rich brown color. And if I'm looking at this and somebody said, well, what do you think of this soil? I'm going to say, I don't see any twigs, any dead leaf material, any plants. I don't see any earthworm tunnels. I see a pile of nutrient deficient soil. Okay. Now, if you go look at this one, what about this one over here on the right side? How would you rate that one? Again, A to F. A B, okay. Anybody else want to share some thoughts? A D, C? Lots of C's and D's. Sandra, you want to see what it looks like under the dry layer? Okay. So if I'm looking at this, I don't necessarily need to see what's underneath that dry layer because I can see that this soil has been worked to death. And it could be because it's a sandier soil. But if I look at this, at the top of this black mulch layer, I can see where it's rained and that rain has grabbed that soil and it wants to run off and it's erosion prone. That's telling me there's not much root material in there. Jen, yes, it looks just like dust. There's not much organic matter that's giving it some structure. And we're going to show you some pictures to hear what that means, but you want some sort of glue that's going to hold that soil together so it's not just going to run off, because if it runs off, that soil has all of your nutrients. And if that soil is running off, one, you're losing your topsoil, but two, you're losing all the nutrients that you're working very hard to get in there. All right, here's another one. How would you rate this one over here on the left? All right. A to B, okay. B, B. Rain, yes, I believe, I agree, it's looking a little bit better. How many of you would turn this away if it showed up in a delivery truck? I'm guessing not many, right? I'm looking at this, there's clearly stuff growing in there. There's probably seeds that are left over from wherever the soil was taken from. It's growing. I can see lots of organic matter. I see leaves and sticks and grass and the whole 9 yards. So I would say this is probably a B, B plus. If this showed up, I would say it's probably full of organic matter. Probably lots of compost, a lot of nutrient rich material in there. Now, what about this over here on the right? How would you rate this last one? B, A-ish. Okay. All right. I would agree. I would say it's probably very similar to the one on the left, but you can see there's lots of organic material. I see some straw that was left over that's going to be composted in. There's some weed issues there, but that's not something to take away from the soil. There's some rocks in there that's going to be a little bit of a challenge for gardening. But again, overall, when you water it, you can even see in the dry areas, it's a little bit darker soil, a good texture. So I would say that's probably got a lot of nice soil health characteristics there. And it likely has some good nutrients as well. So this is the last one. So how would you rate this one in the upper left-hand corner? It's a tough one, right? So we've got some roots in here. There's clearly some organic matter. See, it looks like clay. Okay.
Forgive me, but are those little pieces of gravel, or did they actually add vermiculite or perlite to it? It looks like it's gravel, but I can't tell from my picture.
In the upper left or the bottom right? In the upper left, I'm not seeing that, but in the bottom right.
Bottom right, sorry. I moved ahead. I just enlarged it so I could see better, but I'll hold off on that question. My apologies.
Oh, no problem. In the upper left, yeah, so that looks like clay. And it could be clay, but actually, if you look at that, there's some organic material there. It's holding together nicely. And just because it looks a little bit damp, I would say that's probably a C plus or a B minus. Don't let the clay texture fool you. You know, we all want that loam soil. This is probably a pretty productive soil. It's probably going to hold a lot of water just because it's clay. But there is a deep, rich texture to it. I can see lots of roots. And what do you notice about this shovelful? Is it falling apart or is it holding together? It's holding together for the most part, right? So that means there's some sort of binder or glue in there, whether it's roots or some soil structure that's holding it together. Now, the bottom right-hand corner, you can see it's a little bit sandier texture. It's probably going to drain a little bit better. You can see some of the weeds popping in, dark color, but I don't see much organic matter holding that together. So as we pull it out, what's happening to that dirt? It's falling away. So if we're thinking about the amount of nutrient holding capacity, if we're going to put down a bunch of nutrients, which one's going to hold those nutrients better? Go ahead, use the chat box. Will the upper left clay soil hold more nutrients or the bottom right? Which ones will hold more nutrients? Okay. One vote for the upper left. Anybody else want to take a stab at that? The top, okay. The clay can hold more, good. Yes. So when we're thinking about clay, the clay will hold a lot more nutrients. So we can be a little bit more relaxed in our I almost say relaxed, that's a poor choice of words. So scratch that one for the record. But we have a little bit more reserve capacity in our clay soils than we would in our sandier soils. Sandier soils, you have to monitor your soils a little bit more. If you over apply, you're pretty much guaranteed to lose those. Soil that has a little bit more clay texture or silt, if you apply a little bit more, you may get that in reserve capacity so that it could be there for the following year. Soil or sandy soil, it's much more likely that you're going to lose some of those nutrients. So in a perfect world, and I can tell you this is not Northeastern Ohio, in a perfect world, we're going to have 25% water, 25% air, 5% organic matter, 50% solids, and 45% inorganic or mineral materials to make up, say, a bucket of soil. All right, so if we just go out and fill a 5-gallon bucket of soil, Ideal, 25% water, 25% air. Now, if we are taking our soil and we are running a tiller through it and we're breaking up all that soil structure, what do you think that's happening to our air pockets? That's going to go down, right? So now all of a sudden, if we break up our soil structure, we are going to collapse that soil, and then we are going to have a lot more water. Has anybody ever tilled up a new garden bed and then noticed that the next year it's like a bathtub? It's lower than the surrounding soil, okay? So that's a perfect example of where if you till it, you're actually breaking down your pore space and you are adding more water, and you're throwing this ideal composition out of whack. So the soil texture triangle, if you live in Trumbull County, you all think you're over, clay loam over here, but really we're in the silt loam. We do have a fair amount of sand in our soil. So it's a very productive soil as long as we can get the moisture out of it. But in a perfect world, this is what we're all shooting for, loam. So we have percent clay, percent silt, percent sand. This is a nice little perfect balance if we think about that for productivity. But over here, silty clay loam or silt loam for Trumbull County, we're still in a very productive soils. So soil texture, this is a basic soil property. Again, if you have that 100% clay in your backyard, you need to start praying for an ice age to come in and rip it out and put down sand or better soil. That is unchangeable. You will see a lot of products that are marketed to change your soil structure. Gypsum is one of those products. Say if you have clay soils, apply gypsum, your soil texture is going to improve. You're going to have drainage. You're going to take that clay and turn it into something else. It's hocus pocus. You may get some soil colloids formed to improve drainage for about 6 months, and then it's going to disappear. So you'll be applying gypsum every 6 months to maintain that, but it's not a permanent fix. You cannot change what your base material is. Okay. So soil texture, it's a volume of sand, silt, and clay. So if we think about them in terms of those particles inside of our sports equipment, if we have a sand particle, so if we magnify down our soil, sand is going to be the largest. I like to think of it as a beach ball, right? So if we have a beach ball, that's going to be a sand particle. If we have silt, we're going to think of that more like a soccer ball. And if we have clay, that's going to be more like a golf ball. So sand is going to be the largest, silt is going to be somewhere in the middle, clay is going to be very, very small. And on each of those soil particles is where all of our nutrients are stored. All right. So our soil is negatively charged. Anything that's positive charge wants to attract to it. Now, if we think about this, in a field full of sand, we are going to have less surface area for our nutrients than we will if it's silt or clay. So when we get back to what we were just talking about with nutrient holding capacity, clay has a lot more capacity to hold those nutrients than sand because it has more surface area to attach those nutrients that we apply. And a percentage of each determines a specific soil texture. So we talked about texture, structure, particles. The terminology gets a little overwhelming, but it really comes together about when you take a scoop of shovel out of your garden, what does it look like? Does it hold together? Does it fall apart? So that's soil structure, how soil particles are bound together into aggregates or clumps. So it's a combination of soil particles, pore space, and organic matter. Again, I was talking about those roots. So if we have roots, if we go out and we just pull up a plant, right? We have that ball of dirt stuck to those roots. So that adds to the soil structure because all of those roots are intertwined. They're holding those particles together, and the smaller clumps are called aggregates, and all of that builds up into the larger soil structure. Be modified, especially by smaller plots, acreage. It's more difficult in the slower process and smaller acreages. And what I mean by that, if I want to change my soil structure, if I have a 5x10 raised bed, I can do cover crops, I can do no-till, I can change that soil structure probably in 2 to 3 years, realistically. If I have a 50-acre field, getting that soil structure to change because we're going to have frost heaves, we're going to have a whole lot of other factors going into it, it's going to take a longer time to get that structure to change. So your soil structure determines how much air and water movement will go through your soil. So again, if you have a highly worked soil and it's crusting over, if you're tilling it over and over and over again, we have a hard rain, it compacts that topsoil, it crusts over. That's your soil structure. So if you have a hard, crusty soil on top, water doesn't go through it, you've altered your soil structure. So here's an example of a soil horizon. These are centimeters, so 100 centimeters, it's about 20-ish inches or so. So we think about, we hit our soil pan, your bedrock or plow pan or some hard subsoil surface, our roots aren't going to go any further. That's not exactly true. So here you can see the roots are going to find their way through. They're going to get to the nutrients they need, and may not be the most direct path, but our roots are a little bit more vigorous and powerful than we would give them credit for. Here we take those rocks out, and this is a nice heavy compacted soil. Again, if we look here, most of the roots stop at about 50 centimeters. There's not much going past that, but if we look into this bedrock with gravel, those roots are going down. Okay, they're going down, down, down. If we have a lot of gravel, rock soil, if you had to guess, is that going to be a highly drained soil or a poorly drained soil? Think about that for a second. So if you dumped a bucket of water on this, is that water going to go down or is it going to go sideways? All right. Right. It's going to be a good drainage, a highly drained soil. Right. So if I'm a plant and I need water, how deep do my roots need to go in this soil? It's going to have to go pretty deep to find that water. Now here we have no rocks. If we look at this, this is probably going to be a somewhat poorly drained soil. You dump a bucket of water on it, some's going to go down into the soil, some is going to go sideways. So if we think about that, if I'm a plant, I need water. I don't have to go far to get water in this soil. I'm more concerned about air. So I need to stay somewhat closer to the surface, because if I get down here, I'm not going to be drowned out. I'm not going to get as much water. So this is where if we start messing with our soil structure a little bit and we collapse this down too much, those roots aren't going to get down. And this will make a little bit more sense here in a minute, but we want to make sure that we're optimizing our structure by preventing tilling, not doing anything unnecessary for our soil, so we can start building soil structure over time. All right. So here's another example of soil structure. Here's a root ball. Again, so we can see all the little aggregates, and it overall leads to soil structure. All right. So if we take these and we put them in a slack test, this is just a beaker of water with a little metal screen in there, just a clump of soil put in, and they just let it sit there over time. So imagine this is a 5-inch rainfall. We get a 5-inch rainfall for this soil, soil 1, soil 2, soil 3. Our water in soil 1 is likely to go sideways, all right? Because that water is going to sit there. All of this soil is going to come apart. It's going to fill all of that pore space. There's no place for the water to go, so it goes sideways. And once it do, it takes the soil with it. Same for soil 2 right here in the middle. But if we have good soil structure, all of that soil structure is going to hold together, and that water is going to go around all of that, and it's going to find pore space to go down into the soil profile. Okay. So before we shift gears a little bit, are there any questions about the very, very, very basics of soils? Anybody? I'll give it a second to use the chat box.
I have a question for you.
Okay, go ahead.
And I missed something. I wrote down originally my notes. It says in the beginning, you said you want a dark soil that does not hold its shape when squeezed. So I wrote that down, but now you're saying you do want the chunks for air. So there's a disconnect for me somewhere.
Okay, yeah, no, that's a great question. So we want the soil to be held together by organic matter. So if I'm going to take this soil here and I get it wet and I'm going to squeeze it together, what I'm going to do is I'm going to squeeze out all that pore space, and it's probably going to crumble apart because there's all that organic matter and there's a nice little matrix of structure. If I squeeze it really, really tight, it's probably going to fall back apart. Now, if I have the soil here, so soil 1 and soil 2, that's been tilled and tilled and tilled, and I squeeze it together, it's going to hold its shape when I let it go. But when it rains, it's likely to fall apart because there's no organic matter, there's no root structure, there's no structure at all over time. So we were thinking about compacting in our hand to see what it looks like versus what it will naturally do in a growing situation. Does that make sense?
So you do want it to hold its shape in your hand then?
So if you have a highly compacted soil and you take it out and you squeeze it together, you don't necessarily want it to hold together because it's got a lot of water in it, and 2, it doesn't have any soil structure. So if we take this example here with the roots, we get it wet and we hold it together. What we're going to do is we're going to break down that pore space, and it's probably going to crack open, and we let go of our hand, it will break open. So if I take this little soil particle here in soil 3 in this water and I squeeze it, it's probably going to fall apart. But naturally, if I just let it go in a 5-inch rain, all those roots and those particles are going to hold it together. Because it gets a little confusing. So I want to make sure that it's somewhat answered for you. Did that help? Okay, well, I'll make sure I touch base with you here at the end and try to a better way to explain it. Okay. Any other questions before we move on? No? Okay. So, oh, sorry, was that another question?
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So what do plants need? So this is going back to the basics. So what do plants need? 1, they need water, sunlight, and CO2. That's the basics for photosynthesis. Everything we do in addition to that is either going to make that plant more successful in photosynthetic capacity or less successful, right? So those are the very basics: water, sunlight, CO2. But to be most efficient and grow successfully and have a good yield, they need macronutrients and micronutrients. So macronutrients, they need macros large, they need a lot of it, right? So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Those are the big ones. So when you buy fertilizer, it's always going to have 3 numbers on it. So if it's triple 19, it's going to be 19, 19, 19. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK. Calcium and magnesium here in Northeastern Ohio, we don't typically apply what we consider to be calcium or magnesium fertilizer. If we do, that's going to be in lime. So lime is calcium carbonate, or if it's dolomitic, it's going to be calcium and magnesium. That's going to be our liming material. So if your soil pH is correct, we typically have a high level of calcium and magnesium in our soils naturally. So as long as our soil pH is correct in that 6 to 7 range, we have plenty of calcium. And our soils are high in magnesium as well. Sulfur we're going to touch on this in a little bit. Sulfur is becoming a little bit more tricky. We have had fortunately and unfortunately, a steady supply of sulfur in the form of acid rain over time, right? So as we start cleaning up our cars, we're not putting out as much nitric oxide, sulfur dioxide, that would go up and come down as acid rain, adding sulfur to our soil. So as our environment is cleaning up, we're using up some of that sulfur where we may need to add it back over time. But in Northeastern Ohio, we have a lot of steel mill industry still present, and a long history of steel mill production and just a lot of iron production that provided a lot of sulfur. Sulfur, even though we need a lot of it, we typically have a lot already in our soils here in Northeastern Ohio. So micronutrients, on the other hand, we need them. They're very, very important. They're just as important as macronutrients, but we need much, much smaller amounts. So they're boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, nickel, zinc, and cobalt. These we're going to get into more detail, but when you do a soil test, the big things that you should be looking for are your macronutrients. If you have a concern about micronutrients or micronutrient deficiency, you can check on your soil test to have that done, but it's better to have a leaf tissue analysis because these are such in small quantities in our soil that will make a huge difference. And I'll show you some examples later. A lot of the micronutrient deficiencies look like disease deficiencies. or disease issue. So again, I'm getting ahead of myself here, but we'll get into that. So the first one we're going to talk about is nitrogen. It doesn't matter what you're doing or what your fertilizer program is. You need a source of nitrogen every single year. Okay. So if you put down nitrogen last year, 90% chance it's not there this year, especially if you used synthetic or inorganic fertilizer. So if we look at chlorophyll, don't worry about the soil or the structure here. Just see that there are 4 nitrogens in 1 chlorophyll. So you've all seen yellow plants in your garden, and that's a perfect example. If it is yellow at the bottom and green at the top, it could be disease, but more than likely not, you need to add some nitrogen. So nitrogen is mobile in the plant, so it'll actually go to the new growth, go from the bottom of the leaves to the top leaves as the plant will grow. So most forms are unstable in the soil, so you do need to apply it yearly. So if it is in the soil, it can be volatilized, go up into the atmosphere. And most of our nitrogen soil fertilizers, especially the synthetic, are negatively charged. If it's negatively charged, every time it rains, water is positively charged, positive, negative attract. That water wants to pull that nitrogen with it. So nitrogen is a yearly application that you need to be thinking about. Okay. And again, deficiencies are going to be a yellowing in the bottom up. You can see that this one here on the right is a little bit more spindly. It's a pale green color. It doesn't look as healthy and dark green as this one over here on the left. So phosphorus is the other one. It's very rare that I see phosphorus deficiency in garden or vegetable settings because we have a tendency to over apply phosphorus. But if you do see this purpling on the underside of the leaves, you can see up here, this is purple. You just take your tomato plant, flip it over. Some varieties are purple. You may see this early in the season. If we have a cold spell and there's seedlings that you either just transplanted or just put them in the ground, you may see this when they're young, just because they don't have those roots to get to the phosphorus in the soil yet. So this may be a temporary situation where it'll grow out of it pretty quick. No ill effects. But if you're seeing this purpling of the leaves in mature or nearly mature plants, that's a significant sign of phosphorus deficiency. So phosphorus is actually used in cell replication. It's the backbone of DNA. So if you don't have enough phosphorus, the plant can't grow, it can't replicate and create more cells for either vegetative growth or fruit or vegetable production. Okay. So it's relatively stable in the soil, but you really only want to add your phosphorus based on your soil test report. Okay, and again, I'll show you some examples here in a minute where we have 600, 700 pounds per acre. You really only need about 70 to 100 pounds per acre. And this is the nutrient that's driving the harmful algal bloom in Western Lake Erie Basin of Lake Erie. So you want to make sure that you're not over applying this because there are some serious water quality implications for this and nitrogen and all the other nutrients we're going to talk about. But only apply what you need based on the soil test report for phosphorus. Okay. Potassium is the other one. It's the last of the big 3. So we have NPK, right? Again, on that fertilizer bag, NPK are the big ones. Potassium, you may hear it in Ohio called potash. Potassium is used just about everything. So cellular signaling, water uptake, photosynthesis, you name it, there's probably a role for potassium in the plant. This is much more stable in the soil than, say, phosphorus or especially more than nitrogen. But again, you only want to apply potassium based on soil test levels, right? And when they are low, that's when you want to apply it. Typically, if you over apply potassium, you have what's called excessive consumption. They will take up more potassium than they need, and you're not going to see any yield response. So go off a soil test report for potassium. And here you can see some potassium deficiency. And if I'm looking at this, what are some of the things that you may think this is other than potassium? Anybody? This will typically show up in July and August. So we have a lot of people that think that this is either going to be sun scorch or a drought induced situation where they just need more water. So this can be remedied. This is in soybeans. This can be remedied with an application of potassium. At this point, it may be too late, but you want to be thinking about that for the following year. Okay. So the last of the macronutrients, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Again, if your soil pH is correct, you will have plenty of calcium. But if you start to see some leaf tip dieback, I wish I had a good picture of it, but if you start to see the tips of your leaves starting to die back and not going around the surface. So if we look at a soybean leaf here, so if it's just at the very tip, it's starting to die back, that could be calcium. Again, if your pH is correct, calcium deficiencies are very, very rare in Northeastern Ohio. So on tomatoes and squash and a couple of other vegetable plants, blossom end rot is a huge concern. That is not necessarily a lack of calcium. It is a change in fluctuation of calcium from irregular watering. So adding calcium to fix blossom end rot isn't necessarily going to solve your problem if you're having irregular watering. So make sure that you have sufficient watering. You're not overwatering, going through a drought cycle, overwatering, going through a drought cycle, because that will definitely induce blossom end rot. Again, we have naturally high magnesium in our soils. Magnesium deficiencies are very, very rare in Northeastern Ohio. I have not seen it in the 5 years I've been here in Trumbull County. If you see it, you may have brought in some topsoil for a raised bed or in a high tunnel. But if you are growing in our native soils, you most likely will not see any magnesium deficiency. Again, sulfur deficiencies, this is something you need to be thinking about maybe 10, 15 years from now. Sulfur, you can use ammonium sulfate if you want to add some nitrogen and sulfur. That's 2100. So it's just nitrogen with a little bit of sulfur in it. But anytime you're going to apply sulfur, know that you're going to drop your pH. So typically, our sulfur products will lower our pH a little bit. So if you have a naturally high soil pH of 7.5, you can apply ammonium sulfate and it'll help drop that down just a little bit. Okay. Any questions on macronutrients before I go on? No? Okay. If you do, go ahead and put those in the chat box and I'll try to catch those. So micronutrients, they're very, very important. I can tell you there's nothing more frustrating than trying to track down a micronutrient deficiency because they look like disease or pest issues. But the best way to solve those micronutrient deficiencies, do a leaf tissue analysis. It's just like sending in a soil test analysis, but you're going to take hole punches from your leaf, you're going to put them in a bag, you're going to send them off, and the lab will tell you what are those values in the plant itself. And they'll tell you if you need to adjust that with soil modification the following year. So again, in our native soils, micronutrients are not much of an issue. So if you are applying boron, iron, zinc as a regular basis, you are starting to build up those micronutrients, and they can be highly toxic to plants if you get those concentrations too high. So again, plant tissue analysis is the only way that you can confirm your deficiencies. So iron and boron are two of the probably the more common ones and can be the most frustrating ones. On the left is iron deficiency. If your pH is too high, your soil can have thousands and thousands of pounds of iron per acre. But if your soil pH is too high, it is holding on to that iron and it's not making it available to the plant. If you are growing blueberries, this is going to be one of your biggest challenges. Okay, so blueberries love a pH that is very, very low, 5.5 or less. And you'll see this iron-induced or pH-induced iron chlorosis. So the pH is going to be too high, the blueberries can't take it up, and you get this modeling of the leaves that you can put down all the iron you want. It's not going to change this until you change your pH. Okay. Bridget, one of the natural sources of sulfur I do know of is from volcanoes. Yep. Thank goodness we don't have one close by. but most of our sulfur, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from. So boron deficiency can be challenging. So if you're going to look at this head of cauliflower, what would you think is your primary culprit? Anybody? Insects, right? That's insects, a caterpillar. I would think something that gotten into the plant is eating its way through the center. This is actually from boron deficiency. So again, you can pull your hair out trying to track down these micronutrient deficiencies. The only way to positively confirm that you have deficiency, again, is to do a leaf tissue analysis. Boron in particular, it's very expensive. And if you over apply it, you will have plants that will not grow in your soil. So again, then you're getting into bioremediation of metals that you don't want to deal with. Right. Any questions on nutrients before we go on? We're going to get into individual fertilizers and different sources of nutrients here in just a minute too. So compaction. So this is one of the things that we don't typically think about, but it is definitely contributing to our decrease in yield. So if you have flower beds, I don't want to say flower beds, garden beds that are not raised beds, they're not in a hoop house, and you are tilling on a regular basis, so outdoor production, this is going to be something you're going to have to deal with eventually. So here we have a sunflower plant. So if you're going into the cut market for flowers, this was planted at the appropriate depth, tilled to 2 to 3 inches. What happened to those roots? They're going sideways, right? So they're going to go down. Again, our roots, we don't give them enough credit. Over time, they will eventually get down through there, especially as things dry out. But they want to take the path of least resistance. So they're going to go down and they're going to keep looking and looking and looking for that poor spot to go down, but they never find it. So over time, you're going to have very quick, rapid establishment. They're going to come out of the ground really quick, but about 3, 4, 5 weeks later, especially in drought conditions, that top 2 or 3 inches is going to dry out very quick, and you're going to see some disease issues or a droughty situation because they can't get down to the moisture. Tilling is something that is necessary in some practices, but the least amount of tilling you can do, the better. And I say this in our garden, I've tilled it 3 times already, right? So we are in the process of converting sod into a garden. I know what I'm doing to my soil. I know exactly what I need to do to get it back to where it should be. So once we get our garden into a shape that we want it going forward, we're going to put in some cover crops, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit. And we're going to try to eliminate tilling as much as we possibly can, hopefully all together. So don't work wet soils. We've been very fortunate with a very dry spring. If you're working wet soils, you're going to be making little baseballs that are never going to break up until next year. So if you work wet soils, you're going to have a big challenge. All right. So another thing that we need to think about is soil acidity or soil pH. How acidic is your soil? Again, I'll show you some examples here in a minute. All the soil tests that come back in our office, 80% of them have a pH above 7. We have a tendency as farmers to over apply lime because lime fixes everything, right? But you can see here, this is our soil pH. 6.5 is your magic number. So here we have NPK. These are our macronutrients down to magnesium. These are our micronutrients. So nitrogen, let me back up here. So these bars, the fatter the bar is, the more nutrients that can be uptaken by a plant, right? So down here to pH of 4, this is like a little point, a point, a point. That's so tightly bound to the soil, the plants cannot physically remove it from the soil to take it up. As we increase our soil pH, those nutrients start to lose a little bit of their tightly boundness to that soil particle, so it'll come off and be taken up. And that magic number for our soil pH is about 6.5. 6.5 to 7 is where the majority of our iron can be, or sorry, our nutrients can be taken up. So you can see here phosphorus, if your pH is down to 6, again, you can have 500 pounds per acre of phosphorus. If your soil pH is too low, your plant's not able to take it up. So adjusting your soil pH should be the first thing you do. So if your soil pH is too low, so if it's down to 5, 5.5, 5.8, you need to use lime to raise that soil pH. Now, how much lime do you need to use? The only way to know is if you use a soil test. And if your soil pH is up 7.5 or above, you need to use sulfur, elemental sulfur, to drop that pH. Because you can see just like down here in the low pH, nutrient availability is very low. As we increase our soil pH, nutrient availability decreases as well. If you have a wood stove, if you apply those wood ashes, that is just like lime. So if you're dumping your wood ash into your garden, you're liming your soils and you're going to raise your pH over time. And one of the common household or old wives' tales or old husband tales that we hear, coffee grounds. Coffee grounds will lower your soil pH and it's just good all around for your soil. It's great for compost. Dumping your coffee into your garden is a waste of good coffee. Coffee grounds, by the time it goes to your coffee filter, your pH is probably 6.5, 7, because our drinking water is typically 7.2. So you're essentially neutralizing any sort of coffee by running water through it. So drink your coffee, put it in your compost, but don't use it as a soil pH amendment. So there are various types of products you can use to adjust your soil pH. Lots and lots of different lime products out there. You can choose one based on how you want to apply it. Typically speaking, the more powder-like it is, the faster it will change your soil pH. So down here in the bottom left, this is hydrated lime. It looks like flour. The smaller the particle size, the more easy it is for it to incorporate into your soil. So you can get powdered lime. If you have a spinner spreader, this can be a little bit more challenging to spread. If you have a spinner spreader, this pelletized lime, which has a binder, can be spread a little bit easier. So here is another amendment. If you're buying elemental sulfur, this reminds me of split pea, and it smells very strongly of sulfur, right? So you know that you're buying sulfur if it smells like sulfur. You want to lower your pH for blueberries and acid loving plants. So if you are in the starter business for pine trees or Christmas trees, or in the nursery for rhododendrons, they like a pH about 6 or 5.8, somewhere in there. Blueberries love 4.5 to 5.5. So they love very, very, very acidic soil. All right. And when we put down lime, we're asking our soil to have a chemical reaction. And this just takes time. So we have to give it some time to interact. We have to let the lime come in contact with the soil and let that chemical reaction take place. And it can take 6 to 8 months for your soil pH to change drastically. Lorraine, what about eggshells? Yes, eggshells can change your soil pH. You would need a lot of eggshells. Okay, so if we look at a soil test report and it comes back and says, I need 2,000 pounds per acre of ag lime, you're going to need 2,000 pounds of eggshells per acre to adjust your soil pH. So I would think eggshells in your compost, let it work over time. It's a good way to add calcium and some buffering pH, but it's not a good way to change your actual pH. So if you need to go from a pH of 5.8 to 6.5, eggshells will help you get from 5.8 to 5.8.5, but it's not going to help you make that big jump a whole pH level. Right. Questions on liming products before I go on? Okay. Again, if you do, put them in the chat box and I'll make sure I answer all of your questions before we jump off tonight. So fertilizer, I like to think of these, we can lump them together, synthetic and organic. And I'm not talking organic certified, I'm talking from animal or a plant. So synthetic fertilizers, these are going to be chemicals that are produced through manufacturing. Some of the common ones are urea, MAP, DAP, triple superphosphate, et cetera. The list goes on and on. Because these are water soluble, they are typically much more available to the plant than our organic fertilizers. All of the nutrients are available almost immediately in synthetic fertilizers. Organic forms of fertilizer, whether it's compost, manure, whatever it is, it takes time for those microbes, bacteria, and fungi to break open those chemicals and release those nutrients. So it takes 5, 6, 7 months, possibly 2 to 3 years for all of those nutrients to be made available in your soil. If you use chicken litter, again, getting back into food safety from last week, but if you're using a manure like chicken litter, you're going to get about 1/3 of your nutrients each year. So the first year apply it, you're going to get about 1/3 of your nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and you're going to get the last of the 2/3 over the next 2 years. So think about that in terms of timing. If you have a situation where your tomatoes are yellow, putting down an organic rescue fertilizer is unlikely to be as successful as a synthetic fertilizer because it takes some time to be broken down and made available in the soil. So organic, again, compost, manure, mulch, green manure. We're going to talk more about manure than you'd ever care to because it's not all created equal. Just be planning ahead if you're going to be using organic, because what you do this year will more than likely affect what you do for next year and the following year, rather than if you're applying synthetic fertilizers. So hopefully this is a quick review on your fertilizer. It's NPK, so 18-24-6. This is 18% nitrogen, 24% phosphorus, 6% potassium. Okay, so again, this is a percentage by weight of those actual nutrients. So if we use an example of fish meal, it's 10-6-2. A 50-pound bag contains 5 pounds of N, 3 pounds of P2O5, and 1 pound of K2O. So if you need 200 pounds per acre to grow green peppers and sweet corn, you would need a lot of this fish meal compared to, say, urea, which is 4600. So when you're buying fertilizer, buy based on the cost per pound of nutrient in that bag. I was at a store over the weekend and I saw triple 13. So 13 was on sale for $13 for a 40-pound bag. Triple 19 was more expensive and it was $19.99 a bag. Even though that 13 was on sale, I'm going to spend more and get more nutrients per pound per bag on that triple 19 than the triple 13. There's no difference between triple 13 and triple 19. Plants do not care where the nutrients come from as long as they have them. So if you're buying fertilizer, fertilizer is very, very, very expensive this year. Make sure you're doing the math because it can be a significant difference if you're buying a good high quantity of it. If you're buying micronutrients, sometimes they can be listed separately. So we will see an NPK up here, and down here you'll typically see maybe a sulfur analysis 2-3%, boron less than 1%. So typically micronutrients will also be listed on the front of the bag, but the big three will always be NP and K. So here's an example for fish meal. Sweet corn, 130 pounds per acre is at the low end. We would need 1,300 pounds of fish meal and 3 pounds per 100 square feet for that fertilizer. So if you're going to put in an acre of sweet corn and you want to use an organic fertilizer for organic certified production, make sure that you are not shorting yourself on your fertilizer. Okay. And again, plants do not care which source you use. So if you are going towards an organic market, you want to make sure that you're charging appropriately to make up for fish meal, because organic fertilizers across the board are typically more expensive than synthetic fertilizers. Make sure you're marketing and pricing your products appropriately to make up for that fertilizer cost. So there's some common fertilizers here. These are going to be synthetic versions: ammonium nitrate, ammonium sulfate. Ammonium nitrate not as common as it used to be, for good reasons, because it was what was used in the Oklahoma City bombing. So ammonium sulfate. So this is one of the products that I was mentioning earlier. If your soil pH is 7.5 or above, if you get ammonium sulfate, it's 2100. Sometimes it'll have another fourth number off to the end. It's either going to be 12 or 13. That's sulfur. So ammonium sulfate will have some sulfur that will help you drop your pH if it's too high, and also apply your nitrogen requirements. And you can see that they're all over the place in terms of percentages. And again, plants do not care where it comes from. If I'm looking to buy fertilizer and, oh, sorry about that, and I can get urea, it's twice the price as diammonium phosphate, or sorry, that's a bad one, twice the price as ammonium thiosulfate, I'm still getting more nutrients per pound than some of these other ones. And then there's some phosphorus. You hear MAP and DAP, monoammonium phosphate, diammonium phosphate, that's nitrogen with some phosphorus as well. And then potassium or potash, straight potash is going to be 0,060, and there's a couple of other ones there. Again, these are going to be synthetic fertilizers. So these are chemically derived. They are available to the plant very rapidly. Advantage to this is if you know that your soil test report says I have lots and lots of phosphorus and potassium in my soil, I just need nitrogen. I can go buy urea 46-00 and apply just my nitrogen needs, but not have phosphorus or potassium, and vice versa. I can say, I just need potassium. I don't need any more nitrogen. I can go out and buy just potash. Now, if I wanted to do that with organic fertilizers, because it's organic fertilizers, I mean, it's not coming from a factory, it's typically going to have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So it can be a little bit more of a challenge to balance your soil test results with your fertilizer program. But if you're doing it appropriately, it should be able to work out in the end. But synthetic fertilizers do have the opportunity to be a little bit more customized to your fertility program. So there are some downsides, obviously. They're made of salts. If you've ever spilled fertilizer on your grass, you applied it too close to your plants, you notice that it turns yellow and it burns it. It's a salt. So if you apply salt to your grass, you're in high concentrations, you will kill it. Because they are concentrated, we have a tendency to over apply. You know, if a little will do, what's an extra 5 pounds per acre, right? So next thing we know, our phosphorus and potassium levels start creeping up over and over again. They are cheaper than organic fertilizers, and they are a little bit easier to store. So if I need 1,000 pounds of nitrogen, I can store that pretty compactly on a pallet and bags versus buying 1,000 pounds of nitrogen through a manure source, which is going to be a big stinking pile that I have to then cover and then apply, right? So applying synthetic fertilizers, very, very easy. And you can do it as simply with some of these $30, $40, $100 spreaders. And some of the organic fertilizers are starting to become a little bit more pelletized and easier to apply now. So this is not necessarily an advantage of synthetic fertilizers anymore with some of the newer, better organic fertilizers out there. So organic fertilizers, this is just a snapshot. And one thing I do want to stress, this is just a snapshot. So blood meal is going to vary based on where the blood comes from. If it's pig blood, if it's cow's blood, if it's chicken blood, it's all going to have a different composition to it. The best way to do that is look at the bag, right? So don't use this chart for anything other than a very general guideline. All right, so blood meal, if you need lots and lots of nitrogen, but you have a lot of phosphorus and potassium already, blood meal is going to be a good source of nitrogen and not overload your soil with too much phosphorus and potassium. So if we look at that 13% to 1, if you want bone meal, that's good source of phosphorus. So you can tailor your organic fertilizers for what your soil needs. It's just a little bit more challenging because you don't typically get just nitrogen, just phosphorus, or just potassium. It can be done, but you just want to watch your fertilizer program so you don't see your soil test levels creep up over time to where they're going to be too high and cause a water quality issue. So again, analysis varies by source, company, and processing. So if you get fish meal, whether it's cod, herring, mackerel, all of those are going to vary the nutrients available in those fertilizers. There are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of options out there for fertilizers. When it comes to organic fertilizers, you can buy just cod fertilizer. You can buy just pig blood fertilizer. Just pick one that fits your soil test values and go from there. They do have lower nutrient concentrations. Typically speaking, you can buy some pretty low concentrations of synthetic fertilizers, but you saw in the previous slide that some of those concentrations are 33% phosphorus for bone meal. That's a pretty high concentration. Right? One advantage of these are very slow release of nutrients. So you can think about this. I'm feeding my soil for the next 2-3 years rather than I'm going to give it everything it needs now. The plants are going to take it up. So you can see a longer term, but think of it more like a reserve capacity in your soil. So it's not going to be a straight shot of nutrients. It's going to slow release over time and provide a trickle release of nutrients. And if you're using manure or compost, you do have the potential to build organic matter in your soil. So I've been talking about organic matter over and over and over again. Hopefully by now you've realized that it was at one point alive and can still be alive, but it's composed of carbon, a natural source of carbon. Organic matter is the remains of decayed animals and plants. So dead earthworms, earthworm poop, corn stalks, leaf material, roots that have been left over from the previous year. As those break down, those are the original slow release fertilizer. The more organic matter you have, as that breaks down over time, those nutrients are being released. And it is a perfect, excellent, the best fertilizer source you can get. It increases your aggregate stability, biological properties, and it does increase your fertility. Soil fertility, I should say, right? So it will increase your nutrients available to the plants. There are a lot of miracle cures advertised for your soil. Some go by miracle in the name, but organic matter really is the best thing you can do to drive your soil health and your long-term soil fertility over multiple years. So how do you increase your organic matter? One, we've already talked about this, reduce your tillage. Sometimes tillage is not an option, right? If you're in an organic situation, weed control is best. Sometimes it's just easy to run the tiller through it. If you have, I have a lot of violets popping up in our garden. If you don't want to use chemicals on a 5-acre patch, of course, you're going to till it. You're going to get out the cultivator or the rototiller and control your weeds that way. But anything you can do to reduce tillage will increase your organic matter, because every time you stir that up and you bring that organic matter in contact with oxygen, you increase that decomposition rate. You want to start incorporating cover crops in your garden. So this is a great thing to do. If you're wondering where to start for organic matter and cover crops, rye is probably the easiest thing to start with. It can be a bit of a challenge in the spring, but we'll talk about that here in just a second. If you have a reliable source of manure, preferably composted, you can incorporate that. If you have kitchen waste or kitchen scraps, your leaves that you rake up in your fall, compost those, put them in your garden. That will all add to your organic matter. Leave crop residue. So if you have healthy plants, chop them up, do whatever you need to do, incorporate those back into the soil. If you have diseased plants, get rid of those, because if it will overwinter in the soil, that's going to come back to haunt you. But if you know that those plants that you took all the tomatoes off are perfectly healthy, chop them up, incorporate them back into the soil. That's going to be organic matter for the next couple of years. So cover crops are a lot of options. If you take off a lot of your crops in August, you have even more options. If you have a late season crop like pumpkins, you're probably going to have better success with rye. So after your gardening season, consider planting them. I can go on for hours about the benefits of cover crops. It retains your soil, it suppresses weeds, it keeps the nutrients in the soil, it builds organic matter, goes on and on. Rye is going to be the easiest one to establish. The hardest part about rye is that it will overwinter. So then you have to kill it before you can plant in the spring. Down here, so this is rye. And down here, you can see tillage radishes. You put them in the fall, excuse me, they grow in the fall. They will help create pore space and drainage. They will be killed by a heavy frost, so you don't have to worry about killing them. If you are close to neighbors, you may want to not use turnips or tillage radishes because they smell really, really bad when they're rotting. Okay. But there's buckwheat, there's clover. If you have questions on specific cover crops, you can call and talk to me. You can talk to Amy in Soil and Water. There's a lot of different options out there. If you need nitrogen, clover, or any sort of legume, we can help you find a cover crop that will work for you. And Lorraine, are cover crops essential in raised beds? Are they essential? No. Will they help you build organic matter? Yes. And if you have a lot of weed problems, if you put down a very heavy, thick layer of clover, not many weeds are going to compete with a thick layer of clover or even ryegrass. So it can help you with weed suppression over the winter. All manure is not created equal. So if you are getting dairy manure, horse manure, cow manure, the nutrients are going to vary slightly. Okay. So I'll show you a chart here in a little bit. It varies very, very much. But if you have a source for poultry manure, that is going to be your best source because it's typically going to be about 40, 40, 40. So an NPK, it's high values of everything, but it can be hot. So you want to make sure that you are applying it just like you would any sort of synthetic fertilizer because it can burn your crop. Okay. And going back to our GAPS training from last week, you want to make sure you're applying this in a way that you can separate the plants either by time or space, incorporate it so that you're not going to have food contamination. And if you do this over and over and over again, you do have the potential to overload your soil with phosphorus and potassium. And if at all possible, avoid horse manure because of weeds. Cows and ruminants will break down those weed seeds a lot better than a horse. A horse does not break those down. So if they're eating nothing but weeds and you put that onto your garden, all of a sudden you're going to have all those weeds that horse has eaten, but concentrated coming up into your garden. Okay. Cassandra said, I love using clover in raised beds. It looks pretty too. Yes, clover is a great option. It doesn't get too out of control and it's easier to kill in the spring. So here's an example of dairy manure, or just manure in general. So you can see young dairy cattle, dry cow, lactating cow. What are they eating? High forage, high energy. It goes on and on. So the only way to really know what are in nutrients of manure, if you're building your fertility program based around manure, take a sample of that, send it off, and they'll tell you exactly what you need and how you can apply that. So that sample will tell you what the NPK analysis and some of those micronutrients. Your cheapest fertilizer is going to be compost. So if you have, a lot of leaves, if you are collecting your grass, you can compost all of that. Your kitchen waste, you just want to make sure that you're composting it appropriately to the appropriate temperature, because especially if you're using kitchen waste, that can be a food safety concern. But this is the best way to get those nutrients and organic matter into your soil. So benefits of composting, we again get our organic matter. That organic matter can help improve that heavy clay soils. Again, it's not a permanent, but because once that organic matter is decomposed and gone away, you're right back to what you started with. But in the short term, 2 or 3 years, you can see an improvement of your heavy clay soils, improves water penetration, aeration for roots, and it's free fertilizer, right? And when you have a good, healthy soil with lots of organic matter, you're providing food for earthworms, microbes, all of the things that you need to have a healthy living soil. So one of the big things that I get asked about here in Extension are what can I do to fix my heavy clay soil? And the short answer is nothing. There are a couple of short-term options. The best one and the most obvious one is going to be increasing your organic matter. Organic matter is not going to change your clay soil into a loam soil. It's just going to increase your pore space and just make it a little bit nicer textured soil. And again, organic matter, once it decays and goes away permanently, your organic matter is gone. So it's a constant battle to try and build up organic matter over time. Gypsum, I already talked about this a little bit. It's a great source of calcium if you need it. Not typically do we need it if your soil pH is correct. This will not break up heavy clay soils permanently, but you can probably get 5 to 6 months of better soil infiltration of the top 2 inches of soil if you use gypsum. Do not add sand. This can create a concrete-like material and overall decrease soil health. So it's logical, right? So if we have heavy clay soils, let's just add more sand and we'll start shifting that soil triangle up to loam. Doesn't necessarily work that way, and you would need a lot of sand. So if you don't want to read it all, nothing will permanently correct heavy clay soils. So you're probably wasting your time, short of digging it out and replacing it with soil that you know is a non-clay soil, or building it over time and just raise that up. Those are going to be your best options, raised beds on very, very heavy clay soils. A couple of other common soil amendments, peat moss. It's great for water holding capacity, which can be good or bad, but these are typically going to be in your landscape plants where you're going to have a better option with that. Again, you can temporarily lower your soil pH. So if you're putting in blueberries, using peat moss as part of your raised bed material can help get those blueberries established. Topsoil, there is no regulations on what can be called and what is not topsoil. You can literally take it from a strip mine in West Virginia, dry it out, grind it up, put it through a screener, put it in a bag and call it topsoil. If you are buying topsoil, what you want to look for, just like on everything else that we did on our soil judging, are there leaves, are there sticks, is there actual organic matter in that soil? So if you're buying for topsoil, always ask to see the pre-screened versus the screened topsoil to see if they're actually cleaning out organic matter, or if they're just taking clay subsoil, grinding it up and passing it off as topsoil. Oh, Maria, I see you have a question. Can grass clippings be used for compost if the lawn has been fertilized? Yes, if it's just fertilizer. A lot of times, if you know that you just put down fertilizer and not sort of a crabgrass control or a weed and feed, absolutely use those. But if there's been a weed and feed or crabgrass control and you compost that, that can come back to haunt you in subsequent years. So make sure that it's just fertilizer and there's no weed and feed or crabgrass control or some of the other chemicals that they add to those products now for lawns, because those can prevent seed germination or just kill your plants outright if there is some residue holding over. Some more common amendments, wood ashes. Again, we already talked about these are going to be like a liming material. If you don't want to buy lime, but you know you need lime, if you have a lot of wood ashes, if that's your primary wood heat for your home, if it says you need 100 pounds of lime for your raised bed, you would need 200 pounds of wood ash to get that same liming material as a general approximation. Microbes and beneficials, biostimulants, this is really the Wild West. If you've ever looked at a catalog, you'll see a lot of these that are being sold. There is very, very little to no research to back up many of their claims. So proceed with caution, but most of them are snake oil. So just keep that in mind. Do a little bit of research. Don't Google or search the name of the product. Search for the active ingredient if they even tell you what it is. Some of them are beneficial because they're either going to be growth regulators, which are hormones. There's a lot of research on that. But if we have found this bacteria that grows somewhere and we see a 10 bushel increase in your tomato yield, sure, but prove it, right? So you want to make sure that you're finding that research to back up some of those claims. Non-composted yard waste. So it's good for weed control. So if you have just leaves that are not composted, or wood chips or any other yard waste, you can use that in your garden, but just it's probably better as a weed control to block out sunlight from the weeds. And if you're putting down as non-composted, something wants to break that down. So if you're putting down a very thick layer, or if you're putting in wood chips and tilling it in, wherever there's a wood chip, that microbes in the soil are going to need nitrogen to break that down. So you can rob your soil a little bit of nitrogen. But typically that's not a very common practice. But if you are going to put down non-composted yard waste, leave it on the soil surface. Don't incorporate it until it starts to break down just a little bit. So what not to put in your garden? Keep all animal waste out of your garden. And there's a question mark here next to manure. So if you have tomatoes that are about to be ripened, do not put manure underneath your vegetables or produce, because if it splashes up, then it's a food safety contamination. Non-composted kitchen waste. So if it's non-composted, and when I say non-composted, it gets up to 120 degrees at the center of the compost pile. It's there for 5 days. You turn it, gets back up to 120 degrees for 5 days. You do that until every bit of that compost has been turned and properly composted. That's what I mean by composted kitchen waste. If you don't do that, if you're not checking the temperature, I would apply it in the fall, till it into your garden if you're going to do that, and let it be in your soil over the winter, and it'll start to break down there. Do not put down amendments when they're not needed. If your pH is correct, don't apply more lime, don't apply sulfur, don't apply phosphorus or potassium if you don't need it. And excess nutrients don't always stick around. They end up in Mosquito Lake, they end up in the Gulf of Mexico, they end up in Lake Erie. So they don't just stick around in your raised bed. Every time it rains, a little bit of those nutrients go somewhere, and we're all contributing to our water quality issues. And with that, I'm almost at 8 o'clock. I will take any questions that you have. I'll stop sharing so I can see you all. If you want to turn on your camera if you want, or if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself.
Can you talk a little bit about actually taking a soil sample? I feel stupid, but.
Absolutely. So if you need to take a soil sample, it does not matter how big your garden is, whether it is a raised bed, if it's a 1/4 acre, up to 10 acres, you need 10 to 15 little samples in your collection. If you have a trowel, you want to go out and take 10 to 15 samples. Just take a scoop of dirt down to 6 inches, put it in a bucket, let it dry out, and then you would send that off to a lab with your soil test kit. 1 to 2 weeks, that come back, and you get your soil test results. I can show you what those results look like. Oh, that's not it. Sorry. There it is. All right, can you see that soil test report? So our soil tests go to Penn State. Ohio State does not have a soil testing lab. So here's an example of one that just came in a couple weeks ago, 3/26/2021. And this is going to be a common soil test result. You can see the bar chart tells you below optimum, optimum, above optimum. Those are helpful, but sometimes they're a little misleading. So your soil pH, if you want to find that, it's going to be down here. Can everybody see your soil pH of 8.1? Right. So again, that's going to be too high. So if you want to drop that soil pH, we're going to either use ammonium sulfate, which will drop that down from probably 8.1 to maybe 7.8, 7.7. But if we want to get a significant drop in our soil pH, we need to use elemental sulfur. Okay. And here it says use sulfur. And when you get this back, it'll actually have a back page. When I download this from the internet, it doesn't have the back page, but I'll tell you exactly how much sulfur to apply for your target pH. So if it's a target pH of 6.5, it'll probably tell you to use 2 pounds of sulfur per 100 square feet, so on, and it'll help you do that. But when you collect your soil sample, again, if you are just starting out and you have 10 raised beds, your soil is all the same, you can put those all in one soil test. So again, 10 to 15 samples, little scoops of dirt from each of, from whatever you're going to sample, put those in a bucket, mix them all up. And then from that, you're going to take a cup, send it off to the soil testing lab. And then that's what they use for your analysis. Now, if you have 10 raised beds and you've been treating them very, very, very differently, you're going to want to use a soil test for each of those raised beds, because if you have a blueberry raised bed, your soil pH should be a little bit lower. But if you're growing cucumbers in the next raised bed, when you mix those two together, it's not going to give you an accurate representation of what's in there. So you want to change out the soil test based on management. But if your garden is all one big, I do the same thing to the whole thing every single year, you can use one soil test kit for that. Did that answer your question? Okay. So here's just one. So on the soil test report that comes back, so we have our pH, here's our phosphorus pounds per acre. This one is very, very high in phosphorus, 502 pounds per acre. Again, to grow a successful 230 bushel corn crop, you only need about 70 pounds per acre. And this is one of my biggest complaints with Penn State. Up here, it tells you your optimum, right? But in reality, you're way over here. And here's another example. So in Trumbull County, what we get are either going to be on the starting side or the over loving our soil side. So the first one I showed you was the over loving our soil side. Here is, I just bought this property. I really want to get it going. And then you can see here, this is a different soil test because this is the commercial version. And again, if you want to get a soil test kit through our office, we walk you through this in much more detail than what I'm going to give you here. You get your soil pH, your phosphorus, your potash, your magnesium, your calcium. And then down here, it tells you what you need. So here our soil pH is low. If our soil pH is low, we're going to want to apply lime. Here it tells you need 7,000 pounds per acre. It goes into much more detail in the backside of this form, but I just don't have access to it. Other questions? There are 3 publications that we're going to give to you for on your USB flash drive. This is going to be one of them, soil amendments and fertilizer. This is a great resource if you have questions about what fertilizers to use. Goes down to inorganic and organic. This is probably one of the best summaries of fertilizers, of what to use, and general guidelines of what it is, of all the fertilizers, organic, inorganic. Again, we're going to provide this to you. And here's the other one, the nutrient management for commercial and vegetable crops. This will tell you what your specific, bear with me here. So if I want to grow potatoes, it will tell me what my soil test should be for potatoes. If I want to grow snap beans, it will tell me what my soil test levels in my fertilizer program should be. So again, we'll provide you with that. Let me get to these questions.
Go ahead, Lorraine. You had a question?
Yeah, a couple things. I have 6 large raised beds, and I'm starting on the composting and I'm going to do the cover crops. But if you're starting new now and you want for this gardening season, what would you recommend to start out, since we don't have if you don't have compost and stuff yet, to start out for a good foundation? I mean, I have bought good soil. We went and got it from somebody else, and he said it had really excellent, I mean, it looked like a very good quality soil, but it's not as dark as what I think it should be. So it's just like, just to start it out, what would be that you're going to get it right away? I mean, besides the fertilizer. to get the
Yeah,
benefit
so
from it now, that, without having all the extra time.
yeah, so you're coming quickly up onto the growing season, so you want those nutrients available for this year.
Right.
So the best thing to do is get a soil test, because even though the color may not be there for your organic matter, you may have plenty of nutrients that'll guide you a little bit. But are you looking to use synthetic fertilizers, inorganic, organic, or what is your plan for fertility, Lorraine?
Probably synthetic. I'm not doing organic yet.
Okay.
That's another step down the
Okay,
road.
yeah. So if you want to use inorganic or synthetic fertilizers, do soil test, and then based on your soil test report, but it's probably going to be nutrient deficient if it's coming out of a pile. A balanced fertilizer, again, triple 13, 19, 19, 19. One of those will probably be enough to get your beds going this year. And then again, start building on that organic matter with cover crops and something going into this fall. But it's hard to make a recommendation based on without a soil test. So the first thing you can do is, because you don't need a soil test to apply nitrogen, 2 pounds per square feet of actual nitrogen. You can do some math on that based on what you're buying. That's a good place to start. And I can help you, if you want to give me a call, I can help you do that math depending on what you buy.
If this is any indication, my beds have done very well, but my biggest problems I'm having is my zucchini, my yellow squash, my cucumbers. The leaves get that powdery look. They get brown around the edge and they get that grayish, whitish, powdery look. And my peppers, I cannot get them any bigger than a small fist.
Okay,
Everything else does great.
So what you just described is powdery mildew. It doesn't matter what you do to your soil fertility. Cucurbits, so zucchini, squash, cucumbers, they're very, very prone to it. The best thing you can do for that is try to find varieties that are listed as disease resistant. That's your first line of defense. Your second line of defense will be a regular application of a fungicide. And fungicides are preventative, so if you put those down after the infection period has occurred, you're still going to get disease. But typically, if you have a good resistant variety, you can skip the fungicide, because zucchini, unless you're passing it out to everybody at your church or community group, you're going to have plenty of zucchini before the powdery mildew will kick in and take over a disease-resistant plant. The difference between a resistance package and a zucchini against powdery and downy mildew and one that does not, night and day difference. One plant will be completely dead. The other will survive for 3, 4, 5 weeks and make it through the entire season. So that would be the first thing I would start with, especially with your cucurbits, zucchini, squash, cucumbers, pumpkins, find powdery mildew resistance.
I've tried neem oil. The first time I tried it, it seemed to be help, and then it just didn't anymore.
Yeah, so neem oil, again, timing is everything. It takes one spore. So if you apply your neem oil or any fungicide over top of a spore on a leaf surface, it's too late. You have to put down the fungicide as a protective barrier. So if a spore lands on it, it's landing on the chemical and it won't get into the plant.
Okay.
Yeah, powdery mildew is a challenge, but it can be managed. Ordering ahead, if you go in to buy zucchini or some of the seeds at, say, Menards or Home Depot, Lowe's, they often don't tell you what they're resistant to on the back of the packet. But if you go to Harris Seeds, Johnny's, they will typically tell you if they're resistant or not.
Great. And as far as the peppers, I can't get them very large at all, no matter what I've done. They just don't produce.
Okay.
I thought maybe that would indicate what's wrong with my soil to get it started this year. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, peppers, it could be a variety of things. Could be disease, but peppers do respond differently to soil pH. So your pH could be out of balance just a little bit there. But Lorraine, if you have issues throughout the growing season, the best thing to do is just give me a call. If you're in Trumbull County, I can come out and take a look at it, and we can go from there.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate that.
Okay. Michael, if we choose to grow without cow manure or other animal inputs, what would you say the soil nutrient composition comparison would be relative to other green manures, trying to eliminate E. coli possibility, excessive phosphorus, among other things? I would have to look that up because I don't know that right off the top of my head, Michael. If you're using green manures, typically if you're trying to get nitrogen, clover or any sort of legume is going to be your best bet because they will take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, fix it, and put that nitrogen into the soil. Amy, you may actually know that more than I do. I don't know the like the pounds of nitrogen legumes will put back off the top of my head.
That's a perfect chance to introduce Amy. Amy's with our Trumbull Soil and Water Conservation District, and she also had some resources that she wanted to share. But yeah, if you, not to put you on the spot or anything, but.
Yeah, I'm with Lee on that one. A lot of times we have like charts and things that we have to go through and look up. But one of the things that I did want to mention for those of you who are interested in green manures or cover crops is that between OSU Extension with their wonderful fact sheets and then Soil and Water purchased Midwest Cover Crop Council's Cover Crops Field Guide. And so that goes through like what Lee has been kind of talking about tonight with what cover crops are good for soil building, what's going to be considered a subsoil loosener, what prevents erosion. So some of those things that Lee was showing with highly erodible land, what's a good nitrogen source, and then what provides some sort of forage value. We do have some agricultural producers in Trumbull County are actually grazing their cover crops or harvesting them for a source of forage. And then I know Lee mentioned buckwheat. So we've had some guys interested in doing that because they also have hives. And so that's a source for pollinators for honey production. So in terms of if you're looking at a specific cover crop that you'd like to try, one of the legumes, we can give you the average seeds per pound, when the emergence time is going to be, how you're going to do the methodology, what the soil tolerance is. And then if there's any sort of, whether it needs to be, have nitrogen or another fertilizer kind of source provided for it. So I know we've had some research with some of the guys out of Portage County, Highland County, and Mahoning County. And so I do have some information on that. If somebody wants to follow up with me, I'd be glad to share that.
Okay. I did put in the chat box a link to the cover crop decision tool. So you can go in and put in your goals. Do you want nitrogen scavenging? Do you want tillage? What do you want to do? It's a cool tool to play around with. And it'll also tell you, if our crop is coming off in October, can I really put in clover that late? So that's the fail safe for Trumbull County is gonna be rye. You can put that in all the way up until the middle of October usually and have a pretty good stand establishment. But that comes into what Carla asked a question about. What do you use to kill cover crops? That can be a challenge. So if you are in an organic situation, it's going to be tillage is going to be your primary way to kill that, or mowing, either with a weed whacker, a lawnmower, a brush hog. You can crimp it, but you would have to have the specialized tools. And then if you're not following organic, you just want the organic matter, you can use glyphosate or some other chemical to kill it off. One of the best practices, if you're worried about killing it, is to get a cover crop, whether it's oats or tillage radish, where you let Mother Nature do the work for you. So that cold weather that we get for our winter will kill it. And then by the time that the planting season comes around, it's already degraded, it's decayed. You've got the benefits from the organic matter without the hassle of trying to kill it. Any other questions? Great. And before I forget, you will be getting an email from Ohio State University. So part of my job, I have to be evaluated on my teaching. So if you have any concerns or anything that you want to express, you'll get a survey link. I would appreciate it if you take the time to fill that out. I think I haven't seen the online version, but it's a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is excellent. 1 is I find a new job. Joking, of course, but please be honest and provide feedback. So if you see that tomorrow or the day after, please take a second and fill that out. All right, and I see Amy's putting in some of those numbers there for nitrogen. Thanks, Amy. I think I got all the questions, but did I miss any? If you do have questions,
I'm
please feel
double
free.
checking to make sure we caught everyone.
Yes, and Amy said over application is bad for your budget, not to mention for the environment. Yes, over application is very, very, very bad for your budget. If it's in one raised bed, that's not too much of a concern, but if you have 15 raised beds and you're buying fertilizer and it's $25 a bag, that adds up pretty quick.
And it cuts into your already small profit margins if you are taking that produce for sale too.
Yes. Any other questions?
I just wanted to say, this is Amy from Soil and Water, that I'm really encouraged by all of the people that are attending these sessions and that are reaching out to OSU Extension or Trumbull Soil and Water or TNP trying to find a soil test. I think that is very critical. I think Lee really hit that point home, and that's going to save you money, time, effort, and also protect our water quality and soil health long term. So everyone here deserves a pat on the back.
And if you want to stop into the office, we're open Mondays and Thursdays. You can pick one up in person, or you can order one online, or just give us a call and we can put one in the mail to you too. All right. If there are no other questions, thank you for sticking with us on a very beautiful Tuesday evening, the 5th one in a row. So maybe we should have this every year, Cassandra. It gives us a good spring. Maybe it's good luck.
Yeah, I mean, if that's what it takes, I'm willing to make it work, right? If everybody can get in the ground a little earlier and everything's a little nicer and we don't get snow at the end of April when all the trees have budded, you know?
Right. All right.
Thank you everyone so much for joining us tonight. And if there's no other questions, I see some people are slowly trickling out. We're going to go ahead and wrap up. And again, thank you so very much. Have a wonderful evening.
Take care. Have a good night, everyone.
Also, real quickly, sent you the email over with everybody's email addresses, was able to get everybody except for the person that called in. So I caught the couple people that came in for a while and dropped back out again. So
Perfect. Thank you.
no problem. Have a wonderful night, guys.
You too. Thanks.